Okay, so moving swiftly on, the final session of the day is dressing up antiquity, or that could be dressing up as antiquity. Sarah Wilson, Professor of Contemporary Art at the Courtauld, is going to talk for us for around 10 minutes on the theme of classical camp. And after that, we will have a very broad panel conversation, which will seg us into the final conversations of the day. But thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, James. And it does actually say 15 in the programme. So I know you're all very tired indeed. And could I please have the lights down? Could I please have the lights down? But I thought you would at least have time for Jacques Derrida's Nipples, which you are seeing here for the very first time. This is a very rare photo. This is what he used to get up to in his summer holidays when he would stay with the painter Valerio Adami in the painter's magnificent villa. On the right, in a distraught position, is Camilla Adami, Valerio's wife, and you see on the floor Jacques Derrida's son Jean, and he's holding Marguerite, his wife. And this they did because there was very little to do there, except for write his books, of course. They didn't know anybody in the village. And what is interesting is this idea of a tableau vivant was actually an intellectual pastime in 1970. And that is exactly what I'm going to be talking about, because I curated some time ago the Pierre Klossowski retrospective at the Whitechapel Gallery and became very, very interested in this book called La Monniae Vivante, which has the most deeply complicated text. At the time, it wasn't translated. It's just been I've just seen on the internet that it's translated as living currency, although ever since a moment of greater prominence, our exhibition went to Cologne and then to Paris. People like the choreographer Jérôme Bel have been doing performances taking the idea of living currency, with or without tableau vivant, into the present. Now, this is the photographer who is here, who is also a filmmaker I'll be talking about, is called Pierre Zucker, Z-U-C-C-A, and he did the photographs for Klossowski's book. First of all, who was Pierre Klossowski? He was the brother of the much better known painter Balthus. He was the greatest Sardian scholar in probably the world in the 1930s. He was the person who helped Walter Benjamin, in dialogue with him, turn the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction into a French published text. And the interesting thing for classicists is that with Benjamin, he discussed the project of translating Bachhofen's Mutterrecht, this great German book about how women used to roll, I can't even say it, this is very Freudian. I was going to say rule the world until there was a patriarchal rebellion, which, instigated our modern period. But of course, he was also not only a great translator of Klee, of Kafka, of Kierkegaard, notably Kierkegaard's Antiquity, but also Tertullian, Suetonius, and he translated Virgil's Aeneid and got the Prix Goncourt for translating it in the right word order, dear classicists, can you imagine? And he translated St. Augustine's City of God, and the manuscript was lost forever by the publishers, which is worse than Lawrence's Seven Pillars of Wisdom. But one fine day, looking through this, which always haunts my mind, I had a sudden, horrible epiphanic revelation that it was exactly coterminous with the beginnings of Up Pompeii, which I used to watch as a child, or at least have reminiscences of a child, Frankie Howerd, doing all sorts of naughty things and saying, well, he would, wouldn't he, and so forth, realizing that, that was England and that was France, which has really structured my whole academic career. I'm going to go back, of course, to Frankie Howerd, and what I wanted to say was that on reflection in preparing this paper, I realized, of course, there were many things that these two oeuvres, if you can call them, had in common. Kitsch, an interest in anachronism, a play with a suspension of disbelief, and of course, political parody. What did Klossowski actually say in La Monnaie Vivante? It's very impossible to paraphrase. And here on the right-hand page is his wife Denise, who always starred in his paintings and his drawings and his films, dressed up in kind of Caesar-like costume. what it was basically doing was making, and this is one of the reasons why Klossowski was very important in the 70s, is because he was the greatest translator in France of Nietzsche. And after the moment, after 68, where Marx becomes discredited and Marxisms become discredited, there's a huge intellectual turn to Nietzsche and to the issues of desire, of course, that come out in people like Foucault and Deleuze, who were all Klossowski's fans. And what he was saying, I think I'll quote just to get to the, to get to the basics of this. This is the exhibition called The Vicious Circle, which accompanied the Hans Belmer retrospective at the Whitechapel, with Klossowski underneath. I think that is possibly the thing by Barthes, and here is the letter by Deleuze, or vice versa. Gilles Deleuze said, "You have introduced desire into the infrastructure, or the category of production into desire, finally allowing us to break the sterile parallelisms of Marx versus Freud, money versus excrement." And all through the moment when Deleuze and Guattari were evolving l'anti-Oedipe, Deleuze was in constant correspondence with Klossowski. So there was this idea that money, that bodies are a form of money, which is pretty obvious if you think of prostitution. It was an era of the explosion of the pornography industry in film with things like Histoire d'eau and that kind of business. And it's pretty obvious if you think of the industry, as I was saying, behind pornography or learning from Las Vegas, or whatever, the very construction of Las Vegas or whatever. So that's what Klossowski was up to in Newgate in this kind of 15-minute romp through. Of course, in England, we did have our post-war intellectual classicists who reached a wide population, like Robert Graves' White Goddess book. And of course, each country had its great classical tradition in which successive performances become retrospectively, unbelievably kitsch to look at. This is Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh doing Antony and Cleopatra in 1951, and on the right, France's great actor Robert Hirsch doing Racine, doing Nero in Antiquity in 61. And then we have Marlon Brando's own version of Up Pompeii as a young man. And of course, the break into color makes things even worse. This is a very interesting follow-on, incidentally, from the films in the Leighton House, amazing Alma Tadema exhibition. So this is Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus of 1960, partly starring James Mason, who was going to actually star in Klossowski's films, but then Klossowski decided he didn't want him to, strangely enough, partly for the same reason that you were just mentioning, that he wanted it to be his own production, if you like. And of course, in parallel to all this is the constant scenario of school plays. So we've all actually acted this. In fact, I was only Wall in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I didn't actually make it to Julius Caesar. But there is this whole tradition where schoolboys are involved, and of course, when we get back to Up Pompeii, we're talking about schoolboy humour too. But of course, with Antony and Cleopatra, Burton Taylor, the scenario here, which is very interesting, is that on the one hand, you have absolutely extravagant kitsch, and although one person said it very briefly, and somebody said naff, the one word we haven't heard through this whole conference, which I find quite astonishing, is the concept of classical kitsch. Now, the interesting thing here is when you look at this image or the film, you know perfectly well that it's Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And I'm not just talking, and so the kind of the pleasure of the spectator is watching them being what they're supposed to be. But I'm not simply talking about what I said before, the suspension of disbelief, but something that Klossowski wrote a whole essay on called l'indiscernable, the way that there's an indiscernible slippage between character and personality, between the past and the contemporary at every moment. So I want to go back from this kind of kitschy Antony and Cleopatra to the almost again contemporaneous Frankie Howerd, which evolves from his Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, where he was actually playing the slave Pseudolus. And of course, what's interesting in terms of what I'm talking about, and coming back later on to the tableau vivant, is that these film stills these are actually posed stills. So these are actually tableaux vivants, not just, stills from the film. You see him, of course, galumphing around with all this classical appurtenance, not only groping beautiful ladies. This is probably the wife of the senator Ludicrous Sextus, who's called Monniae, with her daughter Erotica, if that is what's going on. And here he is, it's very fascinating when you're studying Latin at school. I mean, I studied Latin at school. I know it's unfashionable now. But you learn about everyone lying down to eat for Plato's symposium and so forth. Here he is doing that kind of thing. And of course, they're all the power games and the senators and the slave and the this, that, and the other. Ludicrous Sextus also has a virginal son called Nauseous. And there's a soothsayer called Senna the Soothsayer. There were 13 episodes that came up very quickly with titles like Vestal Virgins, Ides of March, Love Potion, but also James Bondus, and so forth. Of course, this issue about kitsch, let alone the polychrome nature of early classical sculpture, which has also, I believe, had rather short shrift here. These are two images from, in fact, Kassel, from the Wilhelmshöhe Museum in Kassel. People paid very little attention to how Kassel had learned from Athens architecturally and museum-wise when in discussing the Documenta. This was something that very, very much fascinated Klossowski because he was an expert in ekphrasis, the kind of imaginary description of, and how imagination translates into reality. And he was, why he was very particular as an intellectual, and of course, when you're talking about intellectuals and how can we fare as people thinking about classicism, when you think of his, if you know his achievement, you can see how absolutely minuscule one is linguistically in every other way. His life was such that he was both French and German, both Catholic and Protestant, with this dreadful secret of his mother being half Jewish, which I'll come back to later. Fluent in French and German, fluent in those rituals, and therefore, although in France and in his French writing he didn't use the word kitsch, it's very interesting that he was interested in the etymology of, which is linked to ugliness, the hässlicher, and also the idea in kitsch that there is what the French call a décalage, something being out of sync with something. It's like the time and the space being out of joint. And within that, and the concept of the uncanny, as you know from uncanny and heimlich and unheimlich, there's both home, but the actual concept of the secret, which is essential to his enormous trilogy called The Laws of Hospitality. I think I will jump on and come back to that possibly. One of his earliest works is very seminal because he repeats it all in various ways. This is the most ungainly. It's the moment of Tarquin raping Lucretius. It's even theological because he, as I said, he was very interested in St. Augustine, and St. Augustine, right at the beginning of the City of God, raises the terrible theological problem of whether apparently Lucretius had sexual pleasure. This is all very topical, I won't go on. But he also was interested in the kind of longue durée, and he wrote a very interesting book published far later than he wrote it or thought about it, called Cultic and Mythical Practices of Roman Ladies, saying, almost like Georges de Huberman's thing about little guts turning into sweets and votive offerings, that the kind of memory of ancient, even pagan sexual practices stayed on in the practices of Roman matrons. But in terms of the thing to do with the relationship between paintings and tableaux vivants, there's the idea that every painting had a model, a living model behind it, and the painting can be reproduced and then turned into a shroud, and you get kind of back through time to the model. Anyway, and I wanted to say here, of course, that this conjunction of classicism, power, money, the classical object here, Diana of Ephesus, so important for Klossowski, becoming a phallic symbol. This is Lorenzo Lotta's portrait of Odone. And the idea of kind of naked sculptures all round the appurtenances of wealth and money, is very much what feeds into La Monnaie Vivante. Back I am here again. So here is Denise actually exemplifying living money, with paper money strewn all over the floor, straddling this man in a way that is, in fact, using a kind of Leonardo da Vinci trope, which he was very interested in, this kind of straddling pose. But the frontispiece of the book, which is this woman kind of tantalizing a little mouse, there are a lot of jokes in Klossowski, is actually based on a Pompeian fresco. Of course, the book's main photographic narrative is not to do with that. It's to do with the kind of actualization of his trilogy called The Laws of Hospitality, in which the hero which he plays, the old Gustav, who had a very, very shady past in the occupation, it kind of rents out his wife into a kind of orgiastic situation. I can't really speed up too much, just to say that certain motifs of what in French is called rapt are based on classical models. This is based on Jean Bologna's very famous sculpture, for example. But and while Denise half the time is in kind of her modern dress with a bit of fur and so forth, and she's much more an older woman. Her secret, incidentally, is that she was a Ravensbrück survivor. Doing this, I knew her, to kind of keep Klossowski happy. But here she is dressed up in her kind of Julius Caesar outfit herself, with this incredibly intellectual text beneath her. He met Pierre Zucker in 1966, and they had this idea of making a film of his novels, which first of all was the black and white experiment, which I've shown you stills of in La Monnaie Vivante, but later on he moved into color in 1975, filming the whole thing in a series with tableau vivant moments in the Palais Royal, where the action was supposed to take place. And this particular one, which she's poisoning Octave here, I believe, but this particular one, which is so fab, really takes us back. I think it's the one that's closest, in a way, to the amazing Derrida moment. But what's interesting about this thing is that Klossowski, at this very moment, is having very interesting conversations with people like the filmmaker Antonioni, because after a dreadful, and I won't say why, relationship with his brother Balthus, he finally, and he's absolutely skint living in a council house where Balthus is calling himself Count Balthus, who, when he was the younger brother and, having a very nice life in the Villa Medici in Rome. So finally, Balthus and Denise accept the invitation to spend their summer holes in Rome. And this is the moment of very, very interesting works exploring dark pasts. It's Pasolini's 120 Days of Sodom, 1975, the same time as The Night Porter, and this very dark exploration of things with a hidden secret. The very strange thing about Klossowski and his Laws of Hospitality trilogy, one of which is called The Revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and I never even asked myself why. That's the moment when the Protestants were sent to England. It's got nothing to do with the narrative of the book, is that he was, as I say, his mother, Baladine, was Jewish, the lover of Rilke, and he and his brother kept this a tremendous secret. Yet in the novel, the actual core of it, which even Foucault doesn't even mention in his essay on Klossowski, he actually says there's an aporia where there isn't. There's a little scroll of deported Jewish children's names hidden in an altarpiece in a classical Italian church in Rome altarpiece. So this was a very strange, I'm coming to my conclusion, James, secret that was a kind of dark heart at the kind of whirl of Klossowski's literary production. What I wanted to say was that the concept of liquid antiquity is obviously a renvoi to Zygmunt Bauman's idea of liquid modernity. And behind Zygmunt Bauman's liquid modernity is his own book, Modernity and the Holocaust. He too had this secret. Behind Learning from Athens is the fact that Adam, who I can't just pronounce his name at the moment, is Polish. It's a very, very dark thing to do with what's going on, even at this moment of notional kitsch in the 70s. So that, these are my last two slides. And the thing I wanted to say was that even Zucker himself, the photographer, had a dreadful dark secret, because his father, Andre Zucker, was the person who was given colour Africa film by the Nazis to create a kind of panorama of very, very jolly occupied Paris that has been recently exhibited in France and caused a huge furore. This is Andre Zucker's very kitschy occupied Paris, very, very posed shots. So that I would like to say that having put this juxtaposition together, where I still go for the kind of cultural difference between Frankie Howerd in this deliberate vulgarity and the French story, if you like, I'd like to say that, thinking how to conclude, Howerd is on the cusp in 1969-70, and there was a repeat series in 75, not merely of postmodernism, but I would argue our contemporary schizophrenia, presaging not only what has been called today, which I think is a rather fabulous phrase, the Grace and Perry end of the couch, but the revenge of the demotic. Because in comparison, if you take somebody like Derrida doing his, indeed, tableau vivant, this is Poussin's Massacre of the Innocents, incidentally, which I think I forgot to say, Klossowski, followed by Taha Ben-Jaloun, followed by Jacques Derrida. There were 50 years of intellectual reflection on the notion of hospitality. Klossowski started by kind of rereading Carl Schmitt and the etymological link between host and hostis, the enemy, and hospitality and sovereignty. And of course, his most famous book is called Who is My Neighbor? So that whereas that other tradition, that European tradition, has that 50 years of reflection, it seems to me that at the moment our own response to these questions is Up Pompeii, which is rather serious. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm now going to invite onto the stage for our final panel conversation of the day, Tiphaine Annabelle Besnard, who is a doctoral student visiting us from the University of Power et de Pays de la Dore, Caroline Vout from the University of Cambridge, Alexandre Singh, once again, who we heard earlier on, Leo Caillard, also an artist, and I may have even got everybody, apart from myself.
Oh, could I just have my pen? Oh, thank you.
Sarah, thank you for an absolutely fascinating paper just there. I mean, there was so much that we could pick up on. I fear we're only going to scratch the surface, and I know that a few other members of the panel have proposed some images that tie in various respects with what you were speaking about. And with that in mind, I might immediately go to you, Alex, because some of these themes, particularly kitsch and, oh, I'm sorry, do you know what? Because we've started with Leo Caillard, I'm actually going to... do you
want to flick through, or do you want to switch gears?
Let's flick through on second thoughts, because my train of thought was running that way.
This is why I
Leo,
loved
I'll come
your
back to you.
presentation this morning, because it was so close.
Alex, you picked a number of images from films by Fellini,
Yes.
and these to me, are not only contemporaneous with some of the things Sarah was talking about, but deal very, very explicitly with these ideas of kitsch and anachronism, and moreover that interesting idea of, we know they're playing a part. I loved what you said about Burson and Taylor, Sarah, and the whole piquancy of the fact that it's them, but it's not them. And Alex, as you speak, I'll flick through some of the images that you brought in.
As Sarah was speaking, she touched on a couple of points that I had been thinking about today, just trying to fill in the gaps. This is a vast subject, there are many things we're not going to talk about. One, which I think is very important, it almost goes without saying, is that for generations from the 19th century right up until perhaps 10 years ago, almost every school child in a Western country will be schooled in Latin and Greek, then only Latin, and then Pig Latin, and then no more. And so here we have an image from Fellini's Roma, where the pitiful schoolmaster who takes Roman civilization very seriously is crossing the Rubicon and saying the immortal line, alia iacta est, the die is cast. And then the next slide, I don't know if we have it, the children have to take off their shoes and wade into this tiny little stream. And then if you move forward in this film, Fellini, who is born in Rimini, but lives the vast majority of his life in Rome, a city which, as Mary Reed and Patrick were discussing, is full of its own rotting corpse. I mean, trying to evoke what it's like to be there. For the Romans themselves, it's kind of suffocating, and this sort of moldy city which gives rise to fascism. And here we have a statue of Julius Caesar, which is mocked because Caesar is emblematic of Mussolini's regime. At this moment, this is a reminiscence of Fellini. If we move forward, a bit more. Then they go to the cinema. Then at the cinema, they see these very kitschy 30s and 40s American and also Italian, almost the equivalent of spaghetti westerns, and that becomes part of the cultural tapestry that leads Fellini to later on make the Satyricon, which would just bring me to the last point I'd like to make before I can pass on the baton, which is that, so for example, the piece that I made, The Humans, which we showed a little extract of this morning, is about the conflict between a rather pompous, Prospero-like character who's an Apollonian figure and his sort of ex-wife, a bunny rabbit, who is a Dionysiac figure. And we think about classical antiquity often in the sort of we talked about this just previously, this contrast between a Bacchic, exuberant, vivacious, somewhat dark, manic Dionysian quality and sort of a pure Apollonian quality. And I want to posit perhaps a third thing which I think Fellini is drawing upon, which informs to some extent the campy Frankie Howerd world, which is Edward Gibbon's idea of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The fact that there's a spirit in Roman literature, in Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, where we find out that Tiberius lived on Capri and that he liked young children to suck on his genitals and pretend they were fish. That his nephew Caligula, who features in the 1979 Gore Vidal written film produced by Penthouse, as a completely debauched character who was probably not quite, much of these stories about these characters are apocryphal, but there's a spirit in late Roman antiquity, the satires of Juvenal, Petronius's Satyricon, which Fellini inhabits because it is like Fellini's work, dreamlike, dark, cruel, full of frustrated desire. And this, what I'm trying to describe is a malaise. It's not something precise or ideological or academic, but it's definitely a feeling that you find in a lot of these works of sort of late impotence and this idea that the barbarians are coming, that we've reached or peaked as a civilization, and that certain Romans are filled with trepidation and anxiety about what's going to happen. This is also something that we're seeing through the lens of later Christian writers. So they look down at these people as effete and disgusting, and they had it coming. They weren't, because they believed in these bizarre rituals. And we see it even in BBC and HBO's Rome series. There's a bit of sort of that kind of titillation. So I'm just offering that up as a third type of feeling that influences filmmakers and artists right up to the present day.
Leo, I want to scroll back now quickly to your work. And you know, this jolts us into something very different in a way. Although I'd be, you know, the link I'd be interested in making is the way in which your Hipsters in Stone series does seem to channel some of the, if you don't mind me saying, the sort of gleeful schoolboy humour that Sarah was talking about, the gleefulness of costume and dressing something up, but also, of course, we're dealing here with a reversal or an inversion of what has been spoken about so far, in as much as you're taking a classical figure, even a classical character, and dressing them up in modern garb. Tell us a bit about the series.
Definitely. I'm very interested on the question of past and present. When you think about past and present in a scientific point of view, it doesn't really exist. It's all about space and time. So we say that it's the past, but it's not that much the past than the present. Dressing status up comes from a French expression that say l'habit fait le moine. It basically means the way you dress up will define who you are for the others. And I like this idea of dressing status up because it completely changed the way you look at the statue. You don't look at an iconic figure from the past. You see somebody from today. It completely switches the point of view that you have on the antics. And also, there is many interesting things about the myth and the antics figures that I would like to bring back into the present time. Like the selfie of Apollo. We are in a society of representation. We love to take selfies, we love to dress up, to be beautiful, to do many pictures of ourselves. It defines exactly maybe the funny things, but also some interesting things about who we are and the social codes that we got all together. It's a humoristic series, of course, but there is a meaning inside. I don't want to keep it only for fun. It's important to have a meaning behind a sense of humor.
Sure.
But a sense of humor, it's very interesting to catch the eye of the viewer. So.
Absolutely. And I mean, one thing I've thought, particularly in relation to the piece you did of the Farnese Hercules, for example, is that dressing that statue up, it in a way magnifies something about the original statue in a sense, in that that statue is almost ludicrous in the first place in terms of how hefty and oversized it is, and there's something you can somehow magnify that point through what you're doing.
I definitely think about what kind of clothing and what kind of final image I will make depending on the figure that I use. And I don't want to, yes, it's disturbing, it's quite subversive, but it's definitely an homage to the antics and not only just a joke. I like what they tell about us. That's the strong connection we can have with antics. We can see ourselves through them. Because of our imagination, we are able to project something about ourselves on the antics figures. And maybe that dressing them up just improve this kind of shock, this kind of feeling of real people. I like to make them look as human beings, just like somebody that you can meet in the street, like just somebody from our daily life. When you see them in museum, most of the time you have this kind of disconnection because they are naked or they don't have any codes from our social daily life. And this kind of tricks, dressing them up, yes, it's fun, of course, but it's definitely something that I like to think about. I like to think about them as human beings, real ones.
I'm now going to scroll back through some images we've seen in order to get to a separate pocket of images that you had selected, Tiphaine, that again offer another facet to this whole conversation. Maybe you could talk us through some of these.
Yeah, so I decided to put some production in this PowerPoint. Yeah, you will show little productions because all these productions are in my database, PhD database, and it was not possible to show all. So contemporary artists always want to update antiquity, and they use lots of registers like ironic, comics, serious, or didactic productions. And they use lots of artistical processes like additions. These antique sculptures have hat on their heads. It is Francesco Vezzoli, an Italian artist. If you want to show With other clauses, you can find the work of Xu Jianghe, a Chinese artist, or Daniel Arsham, an American artist. And they are recent productions. For Daniel Arsham, it is the diangle from an antique productions. There is a problem in my PowerPoint. In the Daniel Arsham's diangle, you can see sneakers, Nike, trousers, so contemporary clothes. And for Xu Jianghe, Chinese Mao clothes. The other one. Yeah, for this production, it is a photograph from Helena Antin, an American artist, and she wanted to create a tableau vivant, and from a production from Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, and she decided to change clothes. Athena as a weapon in her arms. Aphrodite wears an evening dress. Contemporary objects are in these productions, and I got sometimes antique sculptures are not dressing clothes but colors. We show before productions of the Vincent Brinkman and Ulrich Karl Brinkman. It is an archaeological approach, but you can see another production from Xu Jin, another Chinese artist, who decided to paint a marathon boy. So it's funny. So with this example, I don't know if I have another example. No.
I'm not sure, sorry. Yeah.
With these examples, you can see that antique reference travel the world. There are lots of artists with the globalizations of art, European, Asian, American, lots of American artists. So it's interesting to see how the antique reference is used by all of these artists.
Indeed, and having now meandered our way through this topic with the films of Fellini and antique statues dressed as hipsters, and with some of these wonderful examples from you, Tiphaine, of polychromatic sculpture here at the end. Carrie, I'd like to bring you in at this point, and you may have immediate and various responses to what's just been said, but I wondered if we maybe could return to one of the things in Sarah's talk, which was this question of kitsch and the kitschness of 20th century production, and what perspective you have on that as a classicist, and the idea of kitsch as something that we use to think about the classical as in opposition to the classical, or the classical through the kitsch.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. I should just preface this by apologising. I've just arrived, so if I say the odd thing that maybe, seems very obvious to you all by now, I'm sorry. In response to you, James, I think that kind of chimes very much with what I was wanting to do, listening to everybody else, and that's press a little bit harder on both what we mean by classical and what we mean by kitsch, or indeed camp, in that classical camp formulation. Camp supposedly disrupts high art. Camp is, according to Sontag, kind of resolutely modern. And yet, as a classicist, I suppose I would say, back in Rome, prima porta statue of Augustus, borrows Polyclitus's Doryphoran body. Seems pretty kind of camp to me. Or maybe it's too engaged, maybe it's too politicized to be camp. But then if you don't like that, what about all of those wonderful, sexy Greek boy bronzes from Pompeii, all of which were used as lampstands? That seems to me, again, to beg the question, And in a sense, I think, if we're thinking about bad taste, good taste, irony, then I might want to push us so far as to think that camp or kitsch might be a kind of gloss on any act of appropriation of the antique. I mean, if I'm thinking about what Hellenistic art does to classical art, then in a sense I think Hellenistic art, which is the production made after the death of Alexander the Great, it takes those idealized classicizing forms, it takes Hercules and his labors, and it puts a woolly jumper or a t-shirt on them in a way. It domesticates them and turns them into every man. And then I suppose that raises the question of sort of Up Pompeii and where that fits, because, I mean, Up Pompeii is mining a different tradition. Again, I mean, it is a tradition that, as you rightly identified, intersects with the post-plastique tradition. But, you know, everything I've been talking about so far is idealizing sculpture. And if Up Pompeii references anything, then it's kind of referencing what? Or if it's satirizing anything, Thomas Jefferson in a toga? I don't know, Reynolds as Polynesian Omai in a toga? Its main point of reference, I would have thought, was Plautine comedy. You know, all of that kind of Frankie Howerd talking to the camera stuff. So that seems to me a very different kind of classical. And then you mentioned the Satirica, and the Satirica, you know, if that's got a reference to the classical, it's in the fragmentation, disorientation, and it's ahistorical, radically ahistorical. You're so disorientated, you don't know what time you're in. And so that, again, seems completely different. And I think we do need probably to put, maybe you have done already all day, but to push hard on what we mean every time by classical in thinking about what the contemporary is doing to it and with it. So.
Sarah, I wonder if you
yeah, what I'd like to say is, I mean, of course I agree with you, but what's very amazing, and I suddenly say this to new students, that we have this, of course I want to say jouissance, but we have the benefit of hindsight in our disciplines. And with this whole day, the fact is that every person creating whatever they created were on the cusp of their own present. I know that present is a very complicated concept, you know, because the moment of the present is always the future combined with the past. But if you think of, I mean, I had to do Juvenal for my A-levels, actually. So if you think of Juvenal satires, they were like the most absolutely cutting contemporary thing. So there's always that sense of extreme contemporaneity, whether it's appropriation or humorous or satirical or full of political commentary. And the people are always on that cusp. I think Frankie Howerd is also very much to do with the pantomime tradition. And I do think, actually, you know, when you think of boys playing Juliet in every public school, and there's always the one who's going to be the Juliet one, you know, there's an amazing contemporaneity of every manifestation of it, kitsch or not. So the whole thing about time and the present has just like a whole, I want to say now, I want to use it, I don't know why, it's because I'm so tired. This word that Valerio Adami uses before he starts painting, he gets like 400 pots of paint and he calls them his tastieri. They're like all the different little pots that you could actually produce something from. So I think that every single historical moment has got this sort of synchronism of various uses of the classical, all of which relate to the long kind of diachronic history. And really that's what we've been exploring today. But that sense that what you are doing is now is very funny. And then we look back at it and we can't look back at it in the same way. I mean, I'm sure John Gielgud was extremely serious when he played Julius Caesar.
Oh, could I just add? I think what you said about the Plautine influence on Frankie Howerd is very correct. But I would go so far as to say that ideas, and I'm going to be vague with my terminology, ideas of camp, naffness, being out of mode, like out of fashion, are so present, we don't need to read into them. In, for example, Aristophanic comedy with drag acts, making fun of the poet Agathon because he used to write female roles by dressing up as a woman, and he lived with his lover for a very long time. There is I know the word homosexual, we're not meant to ascribe homosexual culture to activity in Greece, but when you read it, there's certainly the feeling of a queenie behavior and very like playing straight when you're not. There's that kind of ideas are very much present, as are ideas of things being naff, things being old-fashioned, and then by the time you get to Rome, it feels very contemporary. We believe that maybe, so Petronius is sometimes thought to have been the cultural or taste advisor for the Emperor Nero, and would criticize court manners, dressing, not being of its time. And so I think that notion of kitsch, which is perhaps a modern construct, is there anyway, because I think there's a universality to the way we think about culture and being fashionable.
And I just was thinking of the incredible realism of Roman portrait busts, where they really looked like, you know, the bloke in the Senate, and yet they were in all their stuff. Where there's always an issue of realism and being true to life, which is fighting against the references. So I think kind of it's tedious in one way because we're all agreeing, although I don't know my Plautine comedy very well. And I do know that all that happened was that the producers of Up Pompeii went to Pompeii by chance and thought we could make a little bit more out of Plausiolus if we tried. And so I don't really think I mean, as far as I've read, which is not very much, I don't think they did super erudite homework.
No, I'm sure they didn't. But you know, but it is a you know, it's arguably a different point of departure.
It's very interesting. And actually, Alex, it reminds me of a Latin nugget that you used earlier. This idea of seria ludo, or playfulness in serious things, and obviously that nicely sums up, well, a lot of the material we've been looking at, including Fellini, including the works of Klossowski, including what Derrida was bizarrely doing in that photograph. I mean, I'd love to know how that came about, and you know, what the backstory to that. But I suppose in a way, I mean, Carrie, that also, just with that phrase in mind, that also springs us to, you know, dart around like this into, for example, the 18th century, because I think that expression was used by, was it members of the Kit Kat Club or some of these, you know, sort of aristocratic young men who went on the grand tour had this sense of seria ludo.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, the seriousness and the completely sort of, you know, plastered are always part of the same game. I mean, one of the things I was going to say, actually, in response to Sarah was, and Up Pompeii, was that, and this may have come out today already, but it was really interesting listening to the filmmakers talk about their film when they said, actually, we were in Rome, and so as though that was kind of obvious that they should then make those films, having been based in Rome. I mean, the aesthetic of those films is so Greek. It's kind of dripping in Hellenism, and I thought that was really kind of, and there is a sense in which we're kind of we're bundling up Greek and Romanness all kind of together, and of course Rome is responsible for that because it is our primary lens, but you know, we do need to keep pulling them apart, I think.
And at this point, I'm just going to ask if anyone from the floor would like to come in and ask a question of anyone on this panel. We've got a few minutes for questions. One here in the middle of the room, and then over here.
Thanks for that. That was absolutely just a lot to think about in that. And one of the things I think we've been dancing around a little bit, and it was just brought up, is the homosexuality, the queer angle of a lot of the things that we've been looking at today and their queer histories. And I was thinking of Eve Kosofsky's Sedgwick's definition of camp, which are a lot of words involved. It's quite long, but it involves a lot of the words that we've been talking about, the fragment, the over-invested erudition of these kinds of things. And I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on sort of the essentially queer nature of camp, you know, drag. I was especially struck in the Musée d'Art Classique of the Keith Haring and the Grayson Parry and the Greek vases all in the same vitrine, and if anyone had anything to offer sort of on that point.
I would just say that that Klossowski was sent by his mother as the older son, not the younger son, to get him out of the way, because she could only afford to feed little Baltus in theory, to be the protege of André Gide, who was the greatest and most notorious homosexual in Paris at the time when Oscar Wilde was sent there. And he was dandled on André Gide's knee all the time. And it was a motif he went back to. He painted portraits of Gide, and actually his mise en abîme structure in his novels is based on Gide's counterfeiters, which brings together swapped identities and the idea of counterfeit money, which feeds into, Monniae Vivante. So, and he was in a very, very gay world until he was initiated by an Englishwoman, actually, not his wife, and not Denise. So in fact, one thing, I could have given a completely different paper, but only at the moment when our catalogue was going to press did I meet Tadej Klossowski, one of Baltus's two sons, and have a look at the love letters that passed between Klossowski and Betty, in which there is the most unbelievable fantasy of everyone being dressed up as Roman centurions with rape and God knows what else happening. It's like the most naughty letter, which has subsequently been published. But the moment that I was talking about in the 70s is also the moment of pieces in using photography as a mode by the transvestite artist. What do I mean? I mean homosexual / artist using transgender people, Michel Journiac. And it was the beginning of Guy Hockenguem and Hockenguem's book Homosexual Desire, and the beginning of gay porn in France and things. There was a whole explosion of things going on, which are like another backstory to the photographs I showed. So, and when everything, and of course it's people keep now forgetting it in art history. It was immediately post-pill, and post Simone Weil's law and things, and before all sorts of nasty things had happened, like AIDS or New Puritanism or anything, and people were extremely and sometimes with trepidation experimenting like mad in a very, what we would now say, gender fluid context, which I think is very relevant to what we're saying, really.
There was a question over here as well.
Thank you very much. Changing directions slightly, I was interested to see, Tiphaine, the images from the Chinese artists that you included, because I think something that perhaps has been lacking a little from our discourse all day is this question of how much, this is possibly a question for myself and for James, but how much we ought to be questioning and problematizing this question of, classicism being a Western, a European-focused issue, and how much we, want to push it beyond that, and how much we want to look elsewhere, and whether we can, and how, how do you feel these Chinese artists are using classicism or not?
Can you repeat slowly? Sorry. My English.
What do you think is different, and this is a question for everyone as much as for you, Tiphaine, what do you think is different about how the Chinese artists, how non-Western artists might be responding to the classical?
This Chinese artist or Asian artist went to Europe during study. So they saw the ancient sculptures in museums, in European museums, and some artists, I think to an artist, Mi Kyung-shin, Jessica knows, is a Korean artist, and she lives in London. So son regard.
The way she looks at things.
What?
The way she looks at things.
Yeah, is different. She lives with sculptures, so it's different. How can I say? Chuzen, we saw before, is a Chinese artist, and I think is Jeff Koons, the Asian Jeff Koons, because his work is something similar as Jeff Koons, and I think his production with classical sculptures is for business a little, because Chinese artists like Shuzhen produce his art in China, but buy his work in Europe and United States. So people, European people or American people who grew up with Antiquity will know the production with Antiquity reference, and people will buy more easily. So,
but I think, I mean, I don't know whether Ian Jenkins is still here, because obviously the British Museum have a version of this sculpture, Drapery Folds, which they put on display a few years ago. But as far as I'm aware, this is actually based on a cast that was in Beijing. I mean, it's part of, it's a cast collection in Beijing that they were using to teach, and actually that then kind of influences the classicism of the Tiananmen Square big official monuments. And, whether or not this is made for economic purposes, it's also obviously highly political and does kind of query everything that we think of as a kind of Aryan appropriation of the same figural type, when Hitler paid millions of lira to bring it to the Munich Glyptothek. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very interesting question, Ruth, as well. And but I mean, for me, it brings up the bigger question of how much we allied the classical and Western. It's way too big a question to answer right now. But there's an even bigger question yet that you could ask of, for example, Chinese contemporary art, and how much it is defining itself at the moment through existing Western idioms. It may be unfair to say that it is, but I know it's part of the debate, and it's a very live question about particularly Chinese contemporary art, which could potentially feed back into
But as you just said, with very specific and deliberate signs of Chineseness that they know are wanted, which are recognised as just the appurtenances, if you like, the clothing of which gives it its market pizzazz.
Yeah. I sense that we're at the beginning rather than the end of a conversation here, but I am going to wrap it up as far as this session is concerned, and we're going to have some closing remarks in a moment from Evelyn Welsh. But before that, I would just like to thank everyone for this panel and the last conversation of an extremely fascinating, eclectic day. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Professor Evelyn Welsh. I'm the Provost for Arts and Sciences here at King's College London. And on behalf of the university, we wanted to take a brief moment, not to get in the way between you and the reception that's taking place, but just to say how important this project is for King's, which is, I suppose, an institution founded on classical values there, in a space which has classical columns around us here. And to hear you talk about serious play, playful seriousness, and indeed about the relationship between classicism and globalism is to put at the heart, through the Department of Classics, what actually is the broader conversation that universities in the UK are having. What is the role of the European tradition today in the 21st century there? And the reason it's been so profound and so provocative is because this workshop is a collaborative venue. It's a collaborative venture. It's a collaborative exploration. At King's, it involves the Department of Classics and the whole Faculty of Arts and Humanities and the Arts and Humanities Research Institute, which are really running today. Cultural programming, which are involved in the associated exhibition in Bush House and the Inigo Rooms, the Classical Now, about which you will hear much more from the 2nd of March to the 29th of April 2018, and the Cultural Institute, which is running the associated student and staff art competition. So today we are working as well with 3 very important external partners. And sometimes when you're in a place like King's, you look at your neighbours and think, gosh, don't they have great paintings there? But actually, they've got great people too there. So I really want to thank the Courtauld Institute of Art, with whom we have worked so closely, Minerva, the International Review of Ancient Art and Archaeology, and the Musée d'Art Classique de Mougins there. And the spring exhibition is a co-production with the museum there. And above all, I want to thank Christian Levitt there. The Modern Classicisms project would not be possible without the generous support that he has been provided there. We really appreciate that investment in the future of our understanding of this key topic. So on behalf of King's College London, Christian, thank you there. It's much appreciated there. So just a reminder, we hope to see you all back here in spring 2018 for the exhibition, which is timed to coincide with the college's co-hosting of the annual meeting of the Association for Art History there, which again is co-hosted with the Courtauld. We'll have various cultural activities to which you are all warmly invited, including Mary Beard, who is delivering the 2018 Rumble Lecture, and there'll be modern classicism events as part of the Open Festival at King's on Friday the 6th of April there. Now finally, I've been asked not to say this. However, I want to say thank you to Michael Squire, to James Cahill, and to Ruth Allen, and to the student ambassador team. A modest group who wanted to stay in the background, but who have done so much to make this possible. So on behalf of everyone in the audience here, could we please say thank you to this wonderful team? We are so privileged. So I'm going to hand back to Michael, who's going to guide you through the rest of the evening's discussion before we invite you to a reception in our portico there. Michael.
So the 3 of us are what is standing between you and the drinks. And I promise we're only going to take, I think we'll limit it to between 5 and 10 minutes, just to round up some of the things we discussed, some of the things we haven't discussed but should have done. I'm going to ask Abby to give us a brief update on some of the questions and comments that have come in by Twitter and Instagram. Abby's been following it. But I promise we'll only be 5 to 10 minutes, and I hope this will really deliver on that idea of dialogue around which the whole day has been structured. So as I said, just take a seat. Abby, are you around? So, Abby, would you like to give us a summary of some of the questions and comments that have come in through Twitter and Instagram?
Yeah. Firstly, thanks everyone who has spoken today. It's been really great. And there's been lots of buzz generally on Twitter about everyone being really excited about it being a new topic and how interesting it is to be delving into these things so from so many different perspectives. So thank you for that. Most of the questions that have come in, ironically, were just dealt with on the in the last panel mostly, but you know, maybe there can be a little bit more of a kind of rounding up. And they've mostly been about kind of the strands of modern classicisms that we haven't been able to touch upon or haven't perhaps had the time to kind of really elaborate on. And so perhaps, you know, it's quite a nice way to close, to just go over some of those things. So one of those was the kind of lower arts, ceramics, figurines, you know, where do they stand in the kind of modern classicisms theme? And alongside that, as we were sort of discussing in the final panel, what happens if we take this beyond Europe? And also what happens if can we delve a bit more into the kind of queer aesthetics, queer history, that kind of modern classicisms opens up for us?
Do you want to say anything about any of this?
I think if I heard you correctly, Abby, the first question about kind of lower art forms, and I guess that perhaps leads back to the session that I was involved in this idea of medium and dimensionality and the sort of the different, I guess, the different hooks that contemporary artists are reaching for in antiquity, and that, you know, the emphasis largely has been on sculpture and the three-dimensional and, you know, the marble, because that is kind of iconic in many ways. But actually, I think there is a wider range of ways in which, you know, we might look to the classical, or to the antique and the Greco-Roman. I guess we need to perhaps unpack our use of the classical there. And I think certainly for me, this question of sort of, you know, the 2D, the 3D, and the medium that's being used is something that I think could be really productive to explore further. I don't know if you had any similar thoughts.
I was just going to say one thing, which is more specific, really, on this interesting idea of queerness, and we dealt with this somewhat in the last panel. As you read out that question, it made me aware of the fact that someone we could have looked at today, not least as a KCL alumnus, is Derek Jarman, who had a fascinating and extremely individual sense of the classical, particularly in works such as Sebastian, the feature-length film he made in the late 70s with Latin dialogue, sometime before Mel Gibson did that with The Passion of the Christ. And then, of course, a work such as Caravaggio. I remember Christian earlier talking about Caravaggio's realism and the way in which Caravaggio's you know, street urchins, or real-life models at least, seem to kind of pounce out of the canvas. In that Jarman film, what's so interesting is the realism of Caravaggio itself is sublimated back into something much more mythological, if I can use that word in a slightly baggy way again. What's so fascinating about Jarman's Caravaggio is that the question of who Caravaggio was or what he did becomes inseparable from Jarman's view of Caravaggio. And I suppose if I can try and broaden this out to be conclusive, that does sum up a lot of what we've been talking about, you know, the sense in which we are always looking, you know, back through time and through our own subjectivities to the classical. It's why this, you know, idea of what modern classicism could mean is not going to be easy or possible to answer. But, you know, but certainly the act of asking questions and trying to be more precise in the act of doing so, I think, is very important.
Are there any other questions or comments that anyone would like to raise or give us towards the end of the day?
I had a question.
Okay.
Something that I think is pertinent to Mary and Patrick, but also to the last panel, and something that perhaps we haven't touched on so much, was just this idea of monstrosity and of vulgarity and the taboo. Because I was particularly interested, and sorry to kind of draw you out of the audience, Mary, but this idea that your Minotaur, your monster, is quite is a sad character that we really feel for, and that the monster potentially is the human figures in your story. And I just wondered, you know, when we're thinking about the classical as something that is kind of on a pedestal that we kind of want to venerate in a sense, but actually there's a sort of underbelly that, you know, is brought up in our discussion of the camp and the Dionysiac and sort of lots of other themes that maybe that I don't have an answer to, but that has really kind of been on my mind kind of throughout the discussions today. I don't know if anyone had a thought on that.
Well, I mean, I agree with that, Ruth, and just that idea of, you know, on the pedestal, off the pedestal, Dionysian, Apollonian, and a lot of these other oppositions. In the end, they're handy enough as we you know, talk our way through this theme, but it's never quite as clear or simple as that. And to go back to Mary's film, I mean, it's really true. My response also was that, you know, there is this very playful, riffing wordplay element to it, but then suddenly you're plunged into something extremely poignant with that dead Minotaur figure on the floor, and that shift in mood. You know, well, I mean, you could compare it with Ovid in a way. I mean, that, you know, that ability to suddenly dip into something much more profound, I think, you know, is amazing, and should counsel us against these over easy oppositions.
I think is precisely what Brooke was advocating earlier on with the whole idea of liquid antiquity, that it's a way of getting around that dichotomization that comes to us so easily, I think, as critics, and maybe especially as classicists, sort of working with these dialectics somehow.
And I think potentially what happens, what that is demonstrating, which has been another theme, is this idea that the classical becomes a useful lens. It feels as though artists today are using the classical very much as a lens to shine back on ourselves and to think about, who we are now. And I guess the question from that then becomes, how much do we want to, or are we able to use that engagement as a way of perhaps looking back to antiquity? Is this a lens that could work in both directions? And how do we as classicists feel about that? Do we want to talk about that on stage? I'm not sure.
I know there are more hands, but I'm worried that we've been here for just over 9 hours. I'm worried that the drinks are outside, and we had to wait an hour and a half since we saw Dionysus and the Dionysian fun of Mary's video. I did want to just ask one favour from you. You remember at the beginning of the day I mentioned those questionnaires in your packs. It would be a great help to us. I know it's the end of a long day, and I know the wine is outside. But it would be wonderful if you could please just remember to fill in that questionnaire and deposit it in the boxes at the back of the room. Very, very briefly, I also wanted to we've said thank you to the Courtauld, to Minerva, and to the MACM, or the Mougins Museum. I wanted to say a very special thanks to all of our student helpers who've really made today so much easier than it could have been, especially to Abby, Belinda, and Caroline, our student ambassadors on this project, but also to Marina, Emma, Esther, Sarah, Connie, Nikki, Sophia, and Ilona. And just from that list, you'll have seen quite how much organisation has gone into this. We're particularly proud as a department to have these students, all of whom, the vast majority of whom, come from classics, have been taught in classical art history, and are so enthusiastic about the subject. And it's so wonderful to have them all involved. So I wanted to give them a round of applause. We also wanted to thank, very importantly, all 35 speakers who have been involved today. It's been, people coming from New York, from the States, from Greece, from Cyprus, from all over Europe. And I wanted to make sure we give all of them a round of applause. And finally, as Evelyn said earlier on, everything that we're doing here, and this is only the beginning, it's only the launch, everything we're doing here has been made possible thanks to the generous support of Christian Levitt. And I wanted again to end the day with one final round of applause for Christian.